Welcome to AI Dispatch, your channel for the latest AI videos on YouTube. If you don't want to miss these updates, please like, subscribe, and share. Ben Horowitz of a 16Z and Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon recently examined how capital, talent, and competition function under extreme conditions. Their discussion challenges three widely accepted frameworks that a 50-year-old engineering principle still governs software development timelines, that market leadership in a category signals competitive strength, and that regulatory debates about AI reflect genuine technical understanding. Their analysis strips these assumptions down to mechanical realities of leverage, fragility, and geopolitical constraint. For half a century, software engineering has operated under Brooks's law, famously articulated in the mythical Man Month: adding manpower to a late project makes it later. The principle is grounded in communication overhead and coordination complexity. You cannot force 9 women to produce a baby in 1 month. Ben Horowitz declares this law obsolete in the era of artificial intelligence. His argument centers on a structural shift in how problems get solved. Historically, software complexity created natural bottlenecks that capital could not overcome. A startup with 10 exceptional engineers could outmaneuver a corporation with 1,000 mediocre ones, because throwing bodies at a problem increased coordination costs faster than it increased output. Horowitz claims that proprietary data combined with sufficient GPU capacity now allows money to directly substitute for time. Capital and compute can brute force solutions to problems that previously required years of iterative human effort. This eliminates the traditional moat that protected smaller, faster-moving companies. When complexity no longer acts as a barrier, leads compress. A competitor with enough funding can close technical gaps almost immediately by deploying computational resources at scale. The implication is severe. Companies can no longer rely on a multi-year runway to capitalize on superior products. Speed advantages evaporate because they can be purchased. Horowitz extends this into a prediction about capital markets. He suggests that the primary driver of future IPOs will not be companies reaching operational maturity, but rather desperate need for public capital to survive an arms race in compute spending. Going public becomes a defensive maneuver rather than a victory lap. David Solomon applies a parallel inversion to the concept of market dominance in finance. 10 years ago, Goldman Sachs held the position as the largest wholesale funder in the world. Standard logic treats this as a competitive achievement. Solomon describes it as a structural vulnerability. Wholesale funding relies on borrowing from other institutions, which introduces volatility. Celebrating leadership in that category meant maximizing exposure to the most fragile funding source available. Solomon recounts how they fundamentally restructured the firm, moving from zero retail deposits 15 years ago to over $500 billion today. This required transforming a 150-year-old investment bank into something resembling a commercial lender, prioritizing deposit stability over wholesale volume. He frames the shift as moving from a growth-oriented metric to a survival-oriented one. Being number one in wholesale funding was a trophy that increased risk. Building a deposit base was unglamorous but durable. The broader principle is that celebrated market positions can mask fatal dependencies. Solomon introduces a second structural argument regarding scale itself. Goldman Sachs operates with a balance sheet of $1.9 trillion. JP Morgan operates at $4.5 trillion. Solomon states plainly that Goldman cannot survive at its current size. He believes they must reach at least $3.5 trillion to remain competitive. This redefines scale not as a measure of success, but as a threshold for continued existence. The logic is ruthless. In global finance, there is no stable middle tier. You either achieve a balance sheet of historic proportions or you become irrelevant. The competitive landscape has bifurcated into titans and casualties, with no room for players who are merely large. Ben Horowitz shifts the discussion to artificial intelligence, presenting a framework that conflicts sharply with current regulatory discourse. Society debates AI as though it were an emerging life form, raising concerns about sentience, rights, and ethical boundaries. Horowitz rejects this framing entirely, describing AI as math. He argues that attempts to regulate or restrict specific models are functionally equivalent to regulating branches of mathematics. This creates a logical absurdity. If a government bans a particular AI architecture, it is effectively criminalizing a set of equations. The regulatory impulse treats software as a discrete entity that can be controlled, when in reality it is a formalized process that can be reconstructed by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge. Horowitz connects this to a geopolitical vulnerability. He warns that if the United States restricts AI development based on concerns about sentience or ethical use, it will not prevent AI from being built. It will simply ensure that the most capable systems are developed in China, where data privacy and copyright restrictions do not apply. Chinese firms can train models on datasets that Western companies cannot legally access, producing statistically superior systems. He reframes copyright and data privacy laws not as ethical safeguards, but as competitive handicaps. Any regulation that limits data access for training purposes guarantees that Western AI will underperform relative to systems built without those constraints. The paradigm shifts from viewing regulation as protection to viewing it as unilateral disarmament in a zero-sum technological competition. Both Horowitz and Solomon converge on a counterintuitive principle regarding the timing of capital raises. Conventional wisdom suggests raising money when markets are favourable and capital is abundant. Horowitz advocates the opposite: raise capital when nobody else can. His reasoning is that capital scarcity acts as a filter. When markets are flush, competent and incompetent players alike can secure funding. When markets collapse, only serious operators with defensible businesses can attract investment. Capital raised during a downturn becomes a weapon because competitors are starved for resources. The ability to operate while others cannot creates asymmetric advantage. David Solomon adds a final observation about the operational reality of leading a public company. In an environment where executives attempt to maintain reputational purity and avoid conflict, Solomon states bluntly that being a public company CEO requires accepting constant litigation. He does not frame this as a sign of misconduct or failure. He describes it as a baseline condition of operating within the American financial system. Litigation becomes a normalized cost of doing business, stripped of moral significance. The expectation is not to avoid lawsuits, but to manage them as routine overhead. This perspective treats legal conflict not as an aberration, but as a predictable friction in a system designed to generate it. Both speakers operate from a shared analytical method. They strip away social conventions, ethical framing, and aspirational narratives to examine the mechanical constraints of their industries. Whether discussing software development, banking infrastructure, AI regulation, or capital strategy, they focus exclusively on leverage, fragility, and competitive physics. Human sentiment and institutional norms are treated as noise that obscures the actual forces determining outcomes. The remaining question is whether organizations and individuals can function effectively in an environment where the only viable strategy is to treat every dimension of competition as a pure optimization problem, devoid of the social and ethical frameworks that have historically governed business conduct. If you're interested in the video featured in this episode, click the link below to watch the original.